Gambler's Gold by Peter Field. Chapter 1. Pat Stevens, ne'er-a-hip sheriff of Powder Valley, gazed bitterly down the sun-drenched length of Main Street of Dutch Springs. Memory flew back a brief few 6 months. He saw Dutch Springs as it was then, a lazy cow town and sleepy and untroubled, ponies flicking flies at the hitching rails, riders drifting through the bat wings of the Gold Eagle Saloon, sunbonnet housewives gossiping in the general mercantile store. That was the Dutch Springs he had known for 10-15 years. Now the shining steel of the Chicago and Rio Grande Railway snaked across the zinc carpet of the sage, crawled further and further up the valley every day, like a huge glistening rattlesnake. And like a rattlesnake, too, it packed a sting, and what a sting it was. With eyes slitted against the glare, the sheriff surveyed the street, black with surging humanity, brawny Irish laborers and sombreroed Mexicans, sober-clad gamblers, sweating Easterners in suits, dance-hall girls, dark-featured desperados and nondescripts, a score of types as foreign as the valley as the coyotes in the calf pen. Even the town had changed beyond recognition, cluttered as it was with the sudden growth of clapboard saloons, tented gambling halls, and sprawling dance halls, all of which were displayed cruelly lettered signs that made a circus of the main street that now stretched away beyond what was once the outskirts of town. The sheriff listened in disgust to the torrent of sound that gave expression to the reckless life of the town. Unconsciously, Pat stiffened in his seat under the wooden awning of the Jewel Hotel. "And this is Powder Valley. Don't it beat hell?" he muttered. "Vulture Valley," cut in the swarthy, stocky individual in rider's garb, seated on his right, bright with inquisitive eyes flecked over the jostling throng that surged over the plank walk. "Reckon you're right, Sam," agreed the sheriff. "Steele sure brought a passel of vultures that fatten like hogs on railway payrolls." A huge man on Pat's further side shook an unruly mop of red hair and glared at the throng with one eye. The lid of the other lay flat upon his cheek, cut through by a jagged white scar that slanted up across his forehead. "Gutter scum," he rumbled. "Thicker'n fleas on hogs. But they'll drift. Thank God. When that steel gets laid, they'll drift." Bareheaded, a white-aproned barkeeper pushed through the knot of loungers who cluttered the plank walk. Glancing quickly to right and left, he finally caught sight of Pat Starr and ambled toward the trio.
"Jasper was knifed in the bucket of blood, Sheriff," he announced. "Reckon there's a trouble a-brewin'."
Pat sighed and rose to his feet and hitched up his gun belt. Killings were commonplace in Dutch Springs these days. Prisoners were packed in the little adobe jail tighter than oysters in a can, and a dozen deputies could do no more than maintain a pretense of order. "I'll be along pronto," he told the waiting barkeep. "You want we should side ye?" inquired Sam, his bright eyes snapping at the promise of trouble. "Nope," grinned Pat good-naturedly. "I gotta stop a riot, not start one. You rest your legs and keep out of trouble." With long, unhurried strides, he moved past the sun-blistered facades of the main street, until his tall figure was swallowed by the tight-packed throng that spilled out of the plank walk into the dusty roadway. Pat knew the bucket of blood only too well. It was the noisiest, toughest, and most unwieldy joint on Main Street, and a tougher breed. A high wall of raw timber, already blackened and shrinking in the burning sun, formed the front. Across the blackened boards the words, bucket of blood were rudely painted in scarlet letters. A wide aperture served as a doorway, but there was no door, for the place had never been closed. Canvas supported on cross beams formed the roof, secured to the windowless plank walls. A long bar ran down the left side of the establishment, flanked by tawny, glinted framed mirrors and shelves upon which a legion of bottles glistened in the light of lamps that swung overhead. To the right were faro tables, chock-a-luck and blackjack and roulette. Between small tables and chairs that were scattered over the sanded floor. In the rear, an archway gave admittance to a dance floor from which a stairway led to the cubicles on the second floor, the nest of the girls. Pushing through the crowd of shirt-sleeved construction hands, Pat wormed his way inside. His gray eyes searched the saloon. Men, bellied 4 deep at the bar, clustered like ants around the gambling tables and bunched in noisy bunches over the floor. Through the archway he glimpsed red-shirted workers whirling short-skirted rouge partners. Clouds of swirling tobacco smoke dimmed the yellow lights of the oil lamps. A cascade of sound filled the air. The deep drone of many voices, the whirl of roulette tables, the clatter of glasses and shrill laughter of women, yelling of drunks, to the scrapings of fiddles. Close to the dance hall entrance men entered and gathered in a dense crowd, agitated by some violent motion in its center. Pat headed towards it. With difficulty he elbowed a passageway through the sweating and yammering men. At last he gained the forefront. A table lay overturned, bottles and glasses spilled in front in the sand. Beside it sprawled a lanky construction worker in earth-stained shirt and dark pants stuffed into high boots. The bone haft of a knife protruded from his hairy chest. His mouth gaped open and his eyes were fixed in a glassy stare. Crouching and tense like wolves for the kill, 2 groups of belligerents glowered at each other over the limp form. On one side were 3 raw-boned, red-faced Irishmen, one flourishing an open jackknife, his companions clutching splittering chair legs and huge paws. Facing them stood a group of dark-featured Italians, thin and wiry, each gripping a slim stiletto. Around them pressed the crowd, shouting, urging, and taunting. Pat stepped into the cleared space, moved between the opposing factions. "Cut on the knife play," he ordered curtly. "Who stuck him?" He jerked his head toward the prone figure. Balking of its show, the crowd snarled like a wolf pack. Curfs and cat calls thickened the air. The sheriff waited patiently until the noise subsided. "Who knifed him?" he repeated. The burly Irishman with the jackknife spat in the direction of the bunch of taut, wiry Italians. "One of them monkeys, and you keep out of this," he boomed. Pat moved towards the Irishman. "Pocket that knife and then point out the killer," he snapped. A concerted howl from the group drowned the Irishman's reply. A wave of men surged forward, irresistibly propelled by those pushed behind. In a flash, the sheriff was packing tight and was oppressed by the humanity, as helpless as a chip in a strong current. A flying boot struck him below the knee. He staggered. A callous fist thudded against his ear. Another boot took him in the groin. Fighting to regain his balance, he went down amid the vortex of men, and as he hit the sanded floor, heavy boots flailed into his ribs. Desperately, Pat fought to regain his feet. Steel had brought new methods of warfare to Powder Valley, of which booting was now the most common. Once flat on the floor, he knew that his life was not worth an adobe dollar. Fighting blindly, he rose to his knees, still surrounded by the crowd of excited, crazed men. A heavy, square-toed Borgin took him in the stomach. Gasping with agony, he fell backwards, head bedded in arms for protection as savage kicks rained down upon him. That's it, he thought dully. Even as his bruised body hit the floor, the sheriff was conscious of a diversion. He heard the flat impact of fists on flesh, howls of pain and protest. A man fell across his body, others were reeling and dodging right and left. The crowd melted. He gazed up into the yellow light of a brass-bowled lamp overhead. Painfully, he thrust his bruised body off the floor and struggled stiffly to his feet. Surly-faced men, some bloodied and battered, ringed him, held at bay by a tanned, black-haired young giant in a checkered shirt, tight breeches and laced knee boots. Behind his rescuer stood a knot of big-muscled Irishmen grasping portions of broken chairs. One spat in his hands and grinned expectantly. "Hurt, Sheriff?" The voice of Pat Saver was pleasant and well modulated. The sheriff stretched his sore limbs and smiled wearily. "I've had been cold meat if'n you didn't butt in. Thanks, mister." He eyed his rescuer, who overtopped his 6 foot by a good 2 inches. The tall, black-haired young fellow was lean and hard-featured and had that of an outdoorsman, tanned deep by long exposure to the sun. His eyes were deep-set, dark and intense, and there was a grim set to his mouth. "Ain't seen you around town?" inquired Pat. "I imagine so." The other smiled. His face had transformed. "My name is North. They call me Bill. Assistant paymaster down at the yard." "Well, Bill, I won't be forgetting. Right now I got some unfinished business." Pat's hand dropped to the smooth butt of the gun on his hip. His eyes challenged the circling onlookers. "Next guy who rushes me gets a lead pill. Who croaked that Jasper?" He nodded at the lax body, now trampled by the score of boots. Again, a roar of interfectin poured from the crowd of Irish, the Poles, the Mexicans, the Italians, and tough construction workers to a man. A swarthy fellow, blurry-eyed and belligerent, stepped out of the throng, bowled forward, mouthing threats. 4 paces from the waiting sheriff he stopped, raised his right arm, and slid a slender blade from a neck sheath. Pat's gun leapt out and up. The roar of the explosion downed the tinkling of the knife as it dropped to the floor. With a howl, the swarthy man grabbed his right hand with the left, striving to staunch the stream of blood that spurted scarlet from his wrist. Sudden silence fell over the surrounding throng, awed by the sheriff's split-second marksmanship. Men on the outer fringes of the crowd began to drift back to the bar and gambling tables. Pat Stevens had established his authority and the fight was over. Pat holstered his smoking gun and was about to move away when a girl disdainfully emerged from the crowd. "Maggie Maloney," murmured Bill North at Pat's elbow. "She's the queen of the bucket of blood. She'd just as soon flash a knife as a smile. Quite a passionate flower, huh?" Disdain dripped from his cool tones. The girl stepped out into the cleared space in which lay the remains of the murdered man, surrounded by fragments of smashed tables and chairs. She eyed the trampled form with casual interest. Passion flower was right, thought Pat. Maggie's shapely form appeared to have been poured into a black velvety dress, glittering with sequins that clung close to every curve. Cut low, it revealed a white neck and more than a suggestion of rounded breasts. Her arms were bare, coppery hair thick and lustrous. They're piled high on her head, secured by a comb that sparkled with tiny bright stones. Her brightly painted lips were as wilful as those of a spoiled child. But it was her eyes, which boldly met his scrutiny, that intrigued the sheriff. They reminded him of a panther, dark and unfathomable, with fires raging deep in their depths. And suddenly she smiled, and they were transformed into soft, glowing pools of seduction.
"What's going on here?"
she demanded, in a lazy, husky tone. Pat nodded at the figure. Jasper was knifed. Maggie's white shoulders lifted in an indifferent shrug.
"So what? There's plenty of the same breed here."
"And plenty of leeches to suck on their blood," mocked North. The girl's eyes flamed, and she took a quick step forward.
"Just what do you mean by that crack, big boy?"
The lazy caress had fled from her husky voice. North smiled coolly. "You got me the first time, Maggie. I mean leeches, silken leeches, swollen fat on gambler's gold." With a swift, graceful motion, the girl leaned down and whipped up her skirt with one hand, displaying slim silken legs, slipped a squat dagger from betwixt a garter top from the other. Before she could straighten, the brawny railroader was upon her. North's strong fingers fastened upon each white arm, and while she screamed and struggled like an infuriated wildcat, he held her with ease, grinning down into her raging eyes.
"Hey, what's the trouble?"
demanded a high-pitched, nasally voice. Pat, a silent spectator, swung around to see a tall, hatchet-faced man, precisely dressed in sober black, flanked with two burly housemen, breaking through the throng. Leroux, the proprietor of the bucket of blood, with his hooded eyes and hooked and acquisitive nose, always reminded the sheriff of a brooding bird of prey. Diamonds glittered on his long, bony fingers. Through his dark, small, darting eyes were venomous. His long face was set in a fixed smile of geniality affected by all saloon keepers, a smile which was as artificial as his neat, well-brushed toupee. A bulge beneath the left armpit of his tight-fitting coat indicated a hideaway gun. Leroux strode to where the disheveled Maggie, half sobbing with impotent anger, struggled ineffectually in North's iron grip.
"Keep your dirty paws off the lady," he snarled.
"I always do." The railroader smiled with his lips, but his dark eyes were wary.
"Crown that big ox!"
shrieked Maggie. Pat thrust between the two men. "Leroux," he warned curtly, "another killing in this joint, and I'll close it down. And get that woman out of here, or I'll arrest her for attempting assault and disturbing the peace. Let her loose, North." The young fellow stepped back. Maggie, panting, patted her coppery hair into place. Leroux, still smiling mechanically, but with vindictive fire in his small eyes, spoke to her in a forceful undertone. With a shrug of her white shoulders, she turned and squirmed in through the crowd. The sheriff touched North on the shoulder. "Reckon we better drift." Together, they threaded through the packed tables that dotted the sanded floor. Out on the plank walk, North inflated his lungs with a deep-drawn breath. "Gosh," he grinned, "this air is sure refreshing after the stench of Leroux's joint." Pat rolled a smoke, appraising the young assistant paymaster's muscular frame and bronzed features thoughtfully. "You know, you don't shape up like an office man," he commented. "I'm not," smiled the young giant. "A mining engineer till I signed up with the Chicago and Rio Grande. Had a bout of malaria in Chile. Invaded back to the States and had a mind to look the West over, so I took this job. Great country out here. Well, if you crave to see some more of it, you better watch your step, advised the sheriff quietly. There was sure death in Leroux's eyes when you was manhandling his gal. She's not his wife? I wouldn't think so, drawled the sheriff. End of chapter 1.